Okay, בוקר טוב, שבוע טוב. Our show today is dedicated as the rest of the series לעילוי נשמת רפאל משה בן אליהו. And this morning we are going to speak about Arav Chaim Hezekiah Medini. Chaim is, as happened many times, a name that was later added at a sickness. So his original name was ברוך רופא חולים. To you too. is Hezekiah Medini, Arav Hezekiah Medini, and many times he wrote his name in Rashi Tevot. It is Chet Mem, Chacham Hezekiah Medini, which is also read as Chacham, right? So it's a misspelling. It should be Chet Kaf Mem for a wise, for Chacham, but it's a play on the way it sounds. So Chacham Chaim Hezekiah Medini, or as he better known after his name, after his book, the Sdei Hamed. And the Sdei Hamed was born in 1832, some say 33, as always. It seems that we have a better knowledge of the date, meaning the day and the month, than we have of the year. So we know it was in Zayin Cheshvan, because he says that he was born on the day in which we begin to request for the rain. So it's Zayin Cheshvan. But, however, it is unclear if it's a Zayin Cheshvan of 1832 or of 1833. So that's, it happens, and I don't think it's very important for us here. But it gives us the era in which he is born, and he's born in Yerushalayim. We know that his family. Second.
100 years ago.
Is that just okay? So we know that his family was in Yerushalayim for at least 3 generations before him, and we also it's very clear that his original the original place of his family was originated from Spain. So where exactly in the middle between 1492 to 18, let's say if it's 3 generations earlier, so the middle of the 18th century, the family came to Yerushalayim, that is very difficult to pinpoint. But this is the general background of the family. So that is a Sfaradim, a Spanish family in Yerushalayim. His father and grandfather were Talmidei Chachamim, and as happened many times with Talmidei Chachamim, they were also Shadarim, or at least his father was, to be more accurate. His father was a Shadar. What is a Shadar? That's an acronym. That's a Rashi Tevot for Shlucha de Rabbanan, a messenger of the rabbis. Now, what does it mean, a messenger of the rabbis? So that is a nice, clean word for a schnorrer. I apologize, but that's what it was, basically. So these people, the Shadarim, they would go from Yerushalayim, or from Tzfat, or from Hebron, or from Tveria, being the cities in Eretz Israel, and they would travel through Chutz La'aretz, and they will ask money in order to support the Jews sitting and learning Torah in Eretz Israel, and that is the famous, what was called the Chalukah system, in which money was sent from Chutz La'aretz and shared by the Jews in Eretz Israel with all the advantages, you may say, that it enabled the Jews in Yerushalayim to invest themselves solely in learning and in Avodat Hashem, and with the obvious challenges of just being extremely poverty, being very, very poor, and not everyone that for some accident was born in Yerushalayim or in Eretz Israel means that he knows how, that he's able to learn. So there were many problems with the system. There were also advantages, and that is the place to where he is being born. Now we have a very interesting testimony of himself about his own wedding. He, according, these are many stories here, and as with all the figures that you are speaking here about, that the stories many times are much more than the concrete evidence that we have. So I will share with you the stories and the evidence, and I will try to differentiate between them to the best that I can, but we have to accept that at least some of the things cannot be clarified to the final degree. So, according to the stories, he was married more or less in his bar mitzvah. Now, I don't know if in the same day. I mean, it's a nice saving of money to have this ceremony the exact same day. I don't think so. But around the age of 13, he was married. And according to the legend, it was because the minhag in Yerushalayim, but in most of the Jewish people, was that you do not ordain someone that is not married. You cannot ordain someone that is not married. They wanted to ordain him already at the age of 13, and that's why he had to get married. Now, I am, as you can hear from my voice maybe, I am a little suspecting this story. It doesn't say anywhere that he was ordained in the age of, I cannot say he did not write anywhere. He wrote thousands of pages. I didn't read even a small part of them. But I read about him, and nowhere anyone quote that he had the teuda of ordination or something that we can see the date and see it was when he was 13. I think it's a nice story. I don't think that getting married at the age of 13 was so rare that we need to find excuses why did it happen. Now, it may be that among the Sfaradim in Yerushalayim, it was not as common as in the Ashkenazim in Europe, but nonetheless, it was not something completely out of the ordinary. And if there was a good shidduch, then you would go for it maybe even in a younger age. And ordaining someone at the age of 13, married or not married, is extremely unusual, even for the great geniuses that we speak here about many times, for the simple reason that even if someone is a genius, and let's say that he is knowledgeable enough to get the ordination in the age of 13, you don't want a rabbi at the age of 13 or a dayan in the age of 13. It's very simple. And so I find it hard to believe, but what do I know? No, it's, everything is possible. So I'm sharing with you the story and what I think is lack of evidence. However, what we do have evidence is for the story of the Chatuna itself. And that is in a paragraph that he wrote many years later. So that is from 1878, even a little later, what we are now going to read that he wrote. And it's is this famous book called the Sdei Chemed, which I would, Be'ezrat Hashem, speak at length as our shiur would progress. But now I just want to read with you the small, or not so small, paragraph. So that's the first source. אחות לנו קטנה, והנה היא לאה, מנשים באוהל תבורך, הייתה כאלמנה. So you can immediately see that he is writing in the Spanish manner, which is that almost every second word is a quotation from a pasuk, is paraphrasing a Gemara. So, אחות לנו קטנה is obviously from Shir HaShirim, והנה היא לאה is Yaakov Avinu, right in the morning saying, and it was Leah and not Rachel, מנשים באוהל תבורך, הייתה כאלמנה, this is from Eicha. So every word here is a phrase taken from somewhere. It makes it beautiful for the reader to read, but many times it obscures the meaning because you try to understand what it really means. So her name was Leah. Was she young? Wasn't she young? Is it just a phrase or is it really means what he says? So that is something that happens from time to time in this type of writing. So the basic fact is that there was a woman and she was widowed. Right? So after this sentence. So a woman and she was widowed. והלכה והייתה לאיש, she went and married a certain man, למשה, השם ישמרהו אמן, הייתה למנה. So she became the wife of a certain man named Moshe, so that's a second marriage. And על ידי חופה וקידושין, בראשית השנה, and she was married at the beginning of the year, בעשרת ימי תשובה, during the 10 days of repentance. So somewhere between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, בשנת 600 תרל"ח שנה. So, as I said, in 18, for us, it's 1878. למניין שאנו מונים בקרסוף בזר קריאה נאמנה. What is קרסוף בזר? אם ירצה השם, as we progress in the shiur. ולא עלה על דעתי הקטנה, so the Sdei Hamed of Hezekiah Medini writes, I have no idea, שום חשש ופקפוק בראשונה. I didn't think there is anything special in someone getting married during the 10 ימי תשובה, between ראש השנה and יום כיפור, כי לא ידעתי שום מנהג בזה, ולא ראיתי כתוב בספר שום דבר מזה. גדולה וקטנה, says, I have never seen any מנהג to do or to do not marry during the 10 ימי תשובה, and I never saw in any one of my books, and we speak about his library, the library of more than 10,000 ספרים. He says, I have never seen in any, and he read them, I never seen in any one of them anything about getting married on the 10 days of repentance. אך אם יום או יומיים יעבור, וישמע את הכל, לעזה המדינה. But the days were passing by, and suddenly I see people speaking, right? Something is boiling. And הזקן שבהם ההוא אמר, נא ראיתי גם זקנתי, ולא ראיתי שום חופה וקידושין בימים הקדושים האלה, ימי סליחה וכפרה, תפילה ותחינה. He says, I lived, נא ראיתי וגם זקנתי, I am young and now I am old, and I have never seen anyone getting married during the 10 days of repentance. Now I cannot control myself, and I would ask you, do it, anyone, please just raise your hands. Anyone, if you ever participated in a chatuna, in a marriage on 10 ימי תשובה? No one. So interesting. Right? It's interesting. Have you ever thought about it? Is it mutar? Is it not? Interesting. אלה דברי הזקן. And that's what this elder man said to him. ודבריו הרעידו את לבבי. And he says, my heart was shaken. שום מנהג. כל שאינו ברור בעיניי שראוי לבטלו. He says, I do not, I am trying not to mock any minhag, לזלזל, to disrespect any minhag, unless I think it is kedai, it is ra'u, it is worthy to completely cancel it. So if there is a minhag that causes problems, I'll give you an example. That's not what he's speaking about. But the minhag to make noise during the reading of the Megillah. So that's a minhag that on one hand, it's written in the Rema. On one hand, you want to keep it, to observe it. It's a very old minhag. That's a minhag of almost for sure at least 1,000 years. On the other hand, that is a minhag that can very easily cause people not to be mekayem, the main mitzvah of hearing the Megillah. So how do you react to such minhagim? So there are minhagim sometimes, I'm saying nothing about making noise during the Haman, but there are minhagim sometimes that you see that there is no other way but to completely void them, nullify them. Why? Because they are problematic. ועיינתי שנית בדברי הפוסקים. So I went again through the poskim, through the rabbis, ולא מצאתי בספרי דבי רב דשכיחי גבאי, הם המדברים בזה. So he says, I went through the books that I have, and שכיחי גבאי, they are frequent by me. I have the sefarim, and I couldn't find anyone saying anything. And now, very interesting, עיינתי בפנקסי הכתובות שבעיר הזו. So he had access to the books of weddings, and he can go through the ktubot and see the dates on the ktubot. So he took it very seriously. So that's almost a historical research. So he went into the office of the rabbinate. He was the rabbi of the city, so no problem for him. And he went in and he sat with all the ktubot and went through the dates, שבו רושמים כל החופות הנעשות בכל ימות השנה, מדי שנה בשנה, ביום פלוני הכניסה פלוני לפלוני, שח כך וכך לנדונתה, חדשים גם ישנים, ולא ראיתי רשום בהם שום חופה שנעשית בימים ההם. He says, you know what? I checked, it doesn't say how long into the past. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, I don't know. And he says, I didn't see anyone, just as we've made this check now. No one got married during these 10 days. Oti, so that's a sign, ki edut azaken ne'emana. The testimony of this elder person is faithful. ולא נפלאתי ליתן טעם לשבח למנהג הזה. And also, when I began to think about it, it's not so difficult to understand the reasoning behind this custom, behind this minhag, not to get married during the 10 days of repentance. כי הימים האלה נזכרים ונעשים. נזכרים ונעשים is from where? From Purim, right? הימים האלה נזכרים ונעשים, that's from Megillat Esther. But he is now, as I said, I cannot point every time because we just would not finish it anything. But It's so interesting the way he writes. It's like his mind is thinking in the halachic terms, in Torah terms. So everything that he says, he almost is coming, not only that the content is Torah, but the form, right? It's a question of content and form. The form is also the form of the Torah. So he says, הימים האלה, but he means 10 ימי תשובה, נזכרים ונעשים ימי תשובה. So they should be days of תשובה, of repentance, of awe. ובחופה דשכיח שכרות, לא ייבצר מקלות ראש, וכמה איסורים, חטאת היחיד והציבור, ובמקום גילה נכנס יין, אין שם רעדה. He says, you know, on weddings, we all know what happens, and especially by the young guys, they drink, and happens what happens. Now, during the whole year, it's not glad kosher, but it's kosher, fine, it's a wedding, let them be happy. But on a 10 ימי תשובה, that is improper. Nishaya, right? You wouldn't say nishaya, but it's improper. So he says, he says, no, we cannot do that. לכן אין מהראוי להביא אותם לידי מכשולות. כן נראה פשוט בטעם מנהגם, והוא נכון. So he says, it's a correct מנהג. However, כל זה אינו אלא בחופת בחורים בתולה, שמרבים בשמחה, ריקודים ומחולות וטוף וכינור ויין משתיהם יעבירם על דעת קונם חלילה. אבל בנישואי אלמון ואלמנה אין כל ששון בשמחה, שבחה, והייתה זאת להם ליגון ולהנחה, על אובדן חברת נעורים אשר ישבו במנוחה, ומי ייתן והיה גדול הבית האחרון, just a second, הבית האחרון מצד מנוחה, ונסו יגון והנחה, ואף כי גם נישואי אלמון ואלמנה נעדר מספר הזיכרונות הנ"ל, אולי לא יתרע מילה. So he says, you know what, the minhag is correct, but nonetheless I was also not wrong. Why? Because the minhag, when is there a problem to get married during the 10 ימי תשובה? Because it is too happy. When a young boy and a young girl, they are getting married, and then, yes, it's extremely happy. But, you know, these two people that just got married, so now I don't know what exactly the history was, but it seems that they were married for long in the first marriage, and they lost their first spouse, and now both are getting married at second marriage at an old age, and it's a different thing. We all have been to this type of marriage and the other type of a wedding, and it doesn't look the same. It doesn't look the same. So he says there is much less kalut rosh. People are much less drinking. Right? I think he is correct. People are much less drinking at a marriage at the age of 60 than in the marriage at the age of 20. I think we would admit that. So he says, this type of marriage that I have allowed on a 10 ימי תשובה, no one would say that that's a problem. And then he says, he said, I've decided much more gently than the way he did. Right. If to be more accurate in the translation, he says that a second marriage in this type of condition is not happy. It is sad. Everyone remember his first spouse. You know, he wants to explain why he was right in marrying them. I don't think that it prescribes. That's the way it must be on a second marriage. The Sheva Brachot, yeah. But if it's an alman and almana, if both are widows, you do not have Sheva Brachot. So problem solved. Problem solved. Now he continues, and I don't want to go into the details. It's so interesting. You see, by the way, how long, at length, he is writing. It's very easy to understand. Some of the rabbis that we have learned about, they couldn't bring their halacha, their halachic discussions, because it was so brief, right? Brief, and more than brief. Dense, thank you, that's the word, dense. So dense, so short. And here is speaking at length, explaining slowly. Right, so for us, it's much easier to learn in that way. Obviously, the problem is then you get Sdei Chemed is 18 volumes. That is the original printing. The print new, it's not so new, it's 50 years old, but the new printing is 10 volumes. but in very small letters. So yeah, so it's but you know what? It really depends. However, it continues, so I'm skipping a little. ועל כל פנים מה שהוסיפו מאנשי העיר הזאת. He says, after I explained to them why on Aseret Mitzvah it's fine, they came with a new thing. They said, during the whole of the month of Elul, you shouldn't get any merit. Right? Why? Because it's a time of tshuva. And he begins to debate, and again he's looking after re'ayot, proofs here and there, and he says, לא ראיתי ולא שמעתי מנהג זה, I didn't ever seen or heard about such a מנהג, ואני מעיד על עצמי שנכנסתי לחופה. He says, I want to give a testimony about myself. נכנסתי לחופה בעיר הקודש, ירושלים, תיבנה ותיכונן, בחודש אלול. So again, we doesn't know the exact year that he was married at, but we know it was in אלול. והיה הכנסת כלה בבית הרב הגדול המפורסם, מורנו ורבנו אברהם יצחק פרחי, והיו על החופה כמעט כל גדולי הדור, רבני גאוני תקיפי דארץ ישראל, זכרם יגן עלינו אמן. He says, you should know, I got married. When you say that חתונות, weddings should not be done on Elul, just know who you are speaking with. I was married on Elul, and all the great Rabbanim of Yerushalayim, the Chatuna was at the house of the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, and all the great rabbis of Yerushalayim participated. As I said, he was from a very important Chashuv family. His father was a Talmid Chacham. So all the Chachamim of Yerushalayim came in, and he says, I'm sure that it is allowed to marry on Elul. By the way, he continues to bring Re'ayot. One of the interesting and important features of the way that he's bringing his Re'ayot, he quotes both Sfaradim and Ashkenazim, and we'll speak about that in length, Be'ezrat Hashem, but he quoted here the Mate Ephraim, that is Rav Margaliot. He is a Galicianer. He quotes, as we just saw, the Rabbanim of the Sfaradim. He quotes later the Chabif. The Chabif is Rabbi Chaim Falaji. So that is a Moroccan rabbi. And then he quotes Reb Shneur Zalman Pinsker. That's not a Moroccan name, right? Reb Shlomo Zalman Pinsker. It was the Abed in Kodesh of Xarson. Now, if I would say the word Xarson 5 years ago, no one of you would have known what I'm speaking about. But now we all know where Xarson is in the Ukraine. And this Rav Pinsker, by the way, told him that their minhag is that you do not begin wedding, you do not do wedding after beginning of slichot. And then he does a very interesting math. He says, okay, so for the Xarson guy, for Pinsker, when do they begin slichot? A week before Rosh Hashanah. But for me, we do slichot during the whole of Elul. So according to what he says, it is correct that we should not do weddings throughout the whole of Elul. But he said, but I did Chatuna during Elul, so he rejects this minhag. So it is very interesting, and you see how he combines everyone from everywhere. That is extremely rare in the beginning. To be honest, it is extremely rare nowadays as well. Not extremely, it is rare nowadays as well. But it was extremely rare in the first half or the second half of the 18th century, and in 19th century, excuse me, also in the 18th. In the history of Torah of Ashkenaz and Sfarad, there were times and periods in which there was good communication between the centers of Torah, and you would see them quote each other freely. For example, in the time of the Ramban, we spoke about it 3 years ago, or 2 years ago. In the time of the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, that is the 30th century, and he had no problem quoting from the Rabbanim of Ashkenaz. He knew the Torah very, very well. He also knew the Torah of Sfard very well, and he was able to combine them. And in later generation in Ashkenaz, they were using the Ramban, the Rashba, the Ritva, all of the Golim of Sfarad. So these were times in which there was a communication. In other periods, in other times, there was more of an insular type of learning, in which every center was really focused on its own Gdolim. And the 18th and 19th century, more or less, basically, were this type of times. It also happened because there was the printing press. There were many more books. So when there is a great influx of sefarim, of books, you don't have the time for everything. So you would naturally focus on what you know. And that's why it became that everyone only reads what his close environment is producing, and there was less transferability of Divrei Torah from one community to the other. He is one of the pipes of communication because he was read by both Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, and he was quoting both Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, and that's why some of the Torah of the Ashkenazim was able to go and be read and seen by the Chachamim of the Sfaradim, and some of the Torah of the Sfaradim was being seen by the Ashkenazim. Okay, so that's about his marriage. Very interesting testimony. So in Elul, all the Rabbanim of Yerushalayim join, and we have a testimony also that even after his marriage, his father continued to supplant him, to give him his living, and he continued to learn, and everything is beautiful, and obviously he was excellent in learning, as we know, because, as I said every time, otherwise we would not have been speaking about him. So everything was beautifully going along till 1853. What happens in 1853? His father dies. Right? You see, the way I tell the story, you understand that the Archimedes point, right? The thing that everything hangs upon is his father, because his father is his supporter. He is the one going to Chutz La'aretz to collect the tzedakah, to bring the money in. So his father died during one of his journeys. So in Iraq, in Bavel, his father dies, and the news reached Yerushalayim, and so it's 1853, so he's around 20 or 21, and Rav Medini finds himself suddenly in a position that he needs to provide not only for himself, but he as a wife and a young son, and two sisters that are not yet married. And he's the head of the family now. And yet his mother, of course. So all of them now dependent on him, and he is a yeshiva bucher. 20 or 21. That's a heavy load. That's a heavy load. And it seems that the Rabbanim of Yerushalayim are gathering in order to help him to see how, it was an important family, a Chashuva family. On the other hand, they couldn't help him. They themselves, all of them, were living in poverty. And the decision was, he had relatives in Kushta, Constantinople, in Turkey. And they decided that they would send him there. A, his relatives would be able to help him. And B, it was a big city. He would find some job in teaching or something, and he would be able to provide himself. Many years later, he wrote a song about that, a poem, that I would like to read with you. Look at source Bet. So as I said, that happened in 1853. As you can see, this was written in 1897. So that is from the perspective of 44 years later. That's a good perspective. And he says, it's a poem. Im eshkach Yerushalayim tishkach yemini. So if I would forget Yerushalayim, I should forget my right hand. Odi tza'ari larabim, ezkera yamim mikedem asher hayu tovim. So I want to make my sorrow known to everyone when I remember the days of old that were the best. נער הייתי כבן 20 שנה בצאתי מירושלים. I was a boy of 20 years old, around 20 years old, כבן 20 שנה, as I left ירושלים. You all remember, right, this תשעה באב, קינה, בצאתי מירושלים, בצאתי ממצרים. אוקיי. בצאתי מירושלים, בעצבון רוח ובריפיון ידיים. So I went and I was sad, and my hands where I was unable to hold them. עזבתי את עיר מולדתי ציון היא ארץ חמדה, תאווה היא לעיניים. I left the city that I was born in, a wonderful land, a desire to the eyes. ארץ מגדלת גיבורי כוח עושי דברו. There is a דלת missing here. תורה ויראת שמיים. מלמד שהמקום גורם לפקוח עיניים עברות והיו למאורות. לדעת מה יעשה ישראל, ואווירה מחכים לו יערכנה זהב פרפיים. So he says the place is a wonderful place. It causes you to become smart. It opens your eyes. He had problems with his eyes throughout his life. So these are symbols that would repeat again and again. He says, there you can really see. He Kodesh, מעשה הקודש. ארץ ישראל מקודשת, שקידשו השמיים. So the land is Kodesh, what is coming out of it is holy, and Eretz Israel is holy because heaven sanctified it. כי מציון תצא תורה ודבר השם ירושלים, שממנה הוראה יוצאה לעולם, תורת השם תמימה, ברא מיראת עיניים. שקט ושלב הייתי בה לתורה, ולא, it says, while I was living there, everything was so quiet. לתורה ולעבודה, תפארת לעושיה, רצון אבינו שבשמיים, was able to sit and to learn and to do avoda. It doesn't mean here that he was selling in a store, it means עבודת השם, התפילה. ויהי בשנת התרי"ג, I added here the civil date, 1853, התרי"ג, נהפך עליי הגלגל, then the wheel made a turn. וקינה מבעילית, I need to moron. על היי שופרה דבלי ורקב עצמות קינה, these are paraphrasing, I apologize that we will not stand on it. ורקב עצמות קינה, ועמדו קינתיים בריבתיים, כי הוסר הנזר והעטרה נפלה, so I lost the crown that was over my head, נפלה עטרת ראשינו, הלא הוא אבינו רואינו, אדוני אבי הראש, הרב החסיד ועניו, מלאך רפאל זצ"ל, so I lost my father, that was like an angel, was the crown over my head, ענוותן כהלל בישראל, להלל מועד לעולם, מן דתן יעידיהן לא משתבש, צבי ידיו בידי הדעיים, so these are praising of his father, מתהלך בתומו, צדיק למנוחות, ואותנו עזב להנחות. So he says, the tzaddik, he went to west, but we remained here to woe. אין לחם ואין סמלה. There was no bread and there was no clothing. Sarah Daniuta Radaf, the minister, the angel of poverty, was chasing us. אז לה ומדלדלה וגם דלו דלה מדיבת נפש ומחלת עיניים. So I had we were going down and down. And again, you see מחלת עיניים. It says my eyes were losing their sight. And that is both an expression for sadness, but also something that we was really suffering from. בעצת השרים והסגנים רבני הדור, אדירים וגאונים מנקיי הדעת שבירושלים. Says, I got an advice from the sarim, the important people, the rabbanim of the generation, the geonim, nekiyei hadat, the people of clean head in Yerushalayim. Utzrachti lehavdil, I needed to make an avdala ben kodesh, not lechol, but lechul. So I had to make a distinction between kodesh, Eretz Israel, and chul, right? And go to chutz haaretz. כי בזולת זה לא מצאו אנשי חיל ידיים ורגליים. He said, if I would not have done that, we couldn't found our hands and feet. We couldn't stand in ירושלים. להחיות את נפשותינו, כי נמס כל לב ורפו כל ידיים. So all my heart was melting and my hands were shaking. דמי עליי, I thought I am כעובר על תרי"ג מצוות. It was for me like I was violating all 613 mitzvot. And remember the year was תר"ש ג'. So he said, in the year תר"ש ג', I was violating all of the תרי"ג מצוות. והיה קשה לי מאוד בעיניי פרדתה, כחומץ לשיניים וכעשן לעיניים. Departing from Yerushalayim was like vinegar to my teeth. I don't know if you like vinegar. He didn't, I guess. So he says it was like vinegar to my teeth and like smoke to my eyes. Again, these metaphors of eyes and seeing. מהשם מצעדי גבר קוננו, כי הוא אמר ויהי, ואני בתוך הגולה, הביאני המלך אל עיר גדולה, של חכמים וסופרים מיראי עיניים. So he says, in the end, מהשם מצעדי גבר קוננו, so meaning God is the one that direct the footsteps of a man, of a human being, so we only can walk on the path that God is creating, is forming for us. And that's what I had to do. So I had to leave Yerushalayim because there was no way that I can stay there. And I came to a big city, he means Irkushta. ואחרי שבתי שמה כ-13 שנה, I sat in Kushta for 13 years. It doesn't expand here on what happened in Kushta. Now, there are different versions. According to some versions, his relatives were really taking good care of him, and he was enjoying a time of, again, learning and developing himself in Torah and in his scholarship. However, according to another version, there is a letter. Again, it's not clear if it's an original letter or not, but it says that the relatives really abandoned him and did not support him when he was there. He had to teach in order to make a living, and he made a very bad living at that. It was very poor. There is another story which, to me, I don't think it's correct. I would share it with you because it is there in the world. It's going around. But I didn't see it in any source, I think, that is earlier than 60 years ago. So now he was Niftar on 1905. So I'm not sure. The story goes that while he was, there is also no location in the different version of the story. There's one version which is cannot be, obviously incorrect. If the story did happen, I think it must have happened in Kushta. So according to the story, he was sitting in a certain Bet Midrash and learning, and there was another student there that was jealous of his learning and his abilities and his knowledge and his memory, which were perfect. And because of this jealousy, he invited him, and so he wanted to somehow besmirch him, slander him. All right. So what he did was he hired the maid. Right, there was a non-Jewish maid that was a cleaning lady, and he paid her money in order to claim that Rav Hezekiah Medini made suggestions to her. And that, of course, made a great noise. The Talmid Chacham that came from Eretz Israel, and everyone knows this is such a tzaddik and such as X and Y and Z. And lo and behold, he's such a low life. And he didn't answer any of the claims because he was a tzaddik, so he didn't want to argue. He denied, but it didn't come into fight. The head of the Bet Midrash decided that he believed him and kept him in place. However, after a few months, but you can understand that everyone was the topic of the talk of the city for a few months. After a few months, the maid saw how tzaddik he is, and she repented. So she went to him, and she says, I want to ask your forgiveness, and I want to publish who really offered me the money, so to cleanse your name. And according to the story, he told her that she shouldn't do so, that he's fine. He would just be happy with her saying that it didn't happen, but there is no need to publish who was the guy that tried to set him up. And it's, again, according to the story, he told this to me. How do we know the story? Because many years later, he told his students that when he made his decision that he would not fight back, then he felt that his mind opens and all the Torah is coming in. And from there on, he became who we know as the Gaon, Rabbi Hezekiah Medini. Now, the story is, it's a beautiful story. As I said, I couldn't find any evidence that in his writing or writing of someone from the generation, at least, that collaborates with that. Now, again, that doesn't mean it's incorrect. It may be that he told it to the students, and the students told to their students, and only in a later generation it came up. Also, you think to yourself, who would make up such a story? It's not a good sounding story. So I don't know. On the other hand, he was already married. I don't know. It's the story doesn't, for me, it doesn't make up. But again, who am I? So I shared with you the story and what I think is lack of evidence, and also it doesn't sound reasonable to me. And also in different versions, it happens in different places and in different ways, which is a sign of it's too fluid, the story. I don't know. Is there a kernel of truth? Is it not? I don't know. If it did happen, it also helped to explain why it doesn't want to expand on what happened in Kushta. Maybe. Okay. After 13 years in Kushta, something happens. What did happen? אחרי שבטי שמה כ-13 שנה, הביאני הלום העיר הזאת קטנה. זה שבטי בה שנת ה-30 שנה, etc., etc. So in 1867, there is one of the gvirim, one of the rich men of Crimea, the Krim, חצי האיכרים, the Crimea Peninsula, is paying a visit to Kushta. Maybe he wants to find a rabbi, maybe just a coincidence, but he comes there and he meets with Rav Medini. He sees there's a real giant in Torah, and he's looking for a job. And they need a Rav. So that's a good match. Now, who are they that need the Rav? It's a very interesting story by itself. And this is the story of the Krimchaks. Who are the Krimchaks? The Krimchaks are the Jews of Crimea. Now, they are not Ashkenazi, nor they are Sephardim, nor they are anything else. They are who they are. Just we have to, meaning we are so used to just split the word between the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim. But you all know there are also Yemenites. The Yemenites are not Sephardim in any way, shape, or form. They are something to itself. And maybe some of you know that there are the Romaniotim, right, which are the Jews of the Byzantine Empire, which is a thing to itself. They are not Sephardim. They are a thing to itself. They are also the Krimchakim. They have been there in Crimea at least from the 10th century, at least, maybe earlier. Mm-hmm. So there are different theories about that. So that's why you're right. According to some, they even go as early as the Beit Sheni. But the problem is that every community in this globe believes that they are remnants from Beit Sheni. It's only a matter of time, I think, that the Jews in the United States will decide that they are there from the time of the Second Temple. It just need enough time to go. So anyhow, I really don't know. There are many theories. Genetics does not support the theory of the Khazar. So it's a problem. It's a problem. It's not a problem. It's an interesting question. If some of you want to expand, you can just Google Krimchaks and you would get interesting results. And of course, everything should be read, as everything on the internet, with a grain of salt, at least. So, critical eye. Anyhow, this is a very unique community because they have been there, as I said, at least from the 10th century. From the 10th century, we have very clear evidence that they are there. So at least from the 10th century, which is very early. And as they were not Ashkenazim, not Sephardim, their minhagim are very different. Also, they didn't have, and I apologize if anyone here is a Krimchak. I mean, that is not very common because, unfortunately, the combination of the communists and Hitler made almost complete annihilation of this community. Very few remained. Very few remained. But I apologize if someone is a Krimchak here or would hear it over the YouTube. But they didn't produce too many Gdolei Torah. And I am being understating here. There was maybe one, in the time of 1,000 years. So that's not so good. And the result was that they were very lacking in just knowing what halacha is. Now, they were not, some even thought they are Karaites because they were just following the Torah Shebichtav because they knew so little, but they were no Karaites. They wanted to follow the halacha as was accepted in the rest of Israel. They just didn't know because there were no Rabbanim there. It was extremely far. They had their own dialect. They spoke their own type of you can say it Yiddish or Ladino, you can call it whatever you want. It was the Tatar language in their own jargon. So that's like Yiddish is German in a specific jargon, and like Ladino is, excuse me? In Crimea? In Crimea. Yeah, yes. So the language was some type of a Tatar jargon. It was somewhat similar to Turkish, somewhat. So he was able to communicate with them because he lived in Kushta for 13 years. So he was able to communicate with them, but they couldn't communicate with the Ashkenazi community, with the Europeans. They are also Spanish, Ladino, very far from what they spoke. So he sees Rav Medini. He sees that he is an able man. And he was a real tzaddik. That goes from all of the stories. He was a real tzaddik. He was the real deal, right? He's a huge Talmid Chacham, and he's available. So he says to him, you know what? We need a rabbi. You're a rabbi. Let's do it. And he invites him to the city of Karaso Bazar. Karaso Bazar means Karas, meaning the city of Karas, or Bazar means on the river called Bazar. That is why it's Karaso Bazar. That is like how it's called, Maine on, Frankfurt on the Main. Frankfurt on the Main. So when sometimes you have cities and you call them according to the river they sit on, because maybe there are other cities with the same name. Now, the whole place was politically very, very complicated. It was 10 years after the Crimean War. Now, again, the Crimean War is not the war of 2012 or whenever Russia just got conquering the Crimea, but it's something that happened in the 19th century, but exactly more or less the same thing. So the Russians, that was like a promo to the First World War. The Russians were fighting the British and the French, and while basically the Russians lost, they were able to take control, because from Turkey, everyone could take anything. The Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, was called the sick man on the Bosporus. They were in decline mode for 200 years. Everyone knew that. It was only a question. The Russians, the dream of the Russians, as I think you all know, is to someday conquer Constantinople. This is Istanbul now. This is Kushta. It's all of these are the same, the different names for the same place. This is the holy city for the Russian Christians, for the Eastern Christians. So they were always trying to get to there. And also, if you have the Crimea, you have the Black Sea. So there were very good reasons why Russia want and still want to this day to hold the Crimean Peninsula. And they conquered the Crimea, and that made this Karmachikim, right? This Krimchikim, these Jews of Crimea, they put them in contact with the Russian Jews now, because they live now under the Russian Jews. And that now again, they are now inviting someone from the Ottoman Empire to become the rabbi, but I think it caused some type of an awake in their Jewishness. I think I'm just speculating now, but I think that's what happened, that they suddenly remembered they need to bring a rabbi in. So they bring him. There are about 5,000 Jews in Karaso. Most of them are these Kimcheks, but also there was a small Ashkenazic community of Jews coming from Europe, your regular Ashkenazic type. And he becomes the rabbi of both communities, which is extremely special, because the Ashkenazim looked upon the Kimcheks as not really Jews, because they were not keeping the same halachot, very different minhagim, so they were really fawning upon them in, I'm sorry to say, a typical Ashkenazic way. And the Kimcheks also were not very happy with these new guys coming to the neighborhood. So the relationship between these two communities were tense. But Hezekiah Medini was really a great Talmid Chacham. I mean, truthfully, it's surprising. It's to be honest, it's somewhere in the end of the world. It's Jewishly speaking, and may I say even generally speaking. It is not a very central place. And they got here a top 8 Talmid Chacham. Someone that can easily be seen as one of the 5 greatest Talmidei Chachamim of the generation, and maybe even higher than that. So it's very interesting that came to be. So I think it was easy for both communities to acknowledge the authority. Also, I guess it was cheaper. If the Ashkenazim would have to bring their own rabbi as well, they would have to pay him. But if you accept the Rabbanut of the guy that the Kimcheks brought, then you are all set. So they decided that that's the best way to go. And he was the Rav there from 1867 to 1899. That is 32 years. 32 years. As I said, the community was not in a good shape, Jewishly. Let's see the source Gimel here. זה לשנת 24 בתוך עמי אנוכי יושב, בעיר הזאת קרסוב בזאר. So he says that is my 24th year that was written. So if it's written in 24th year, that is 1871. So in 1871 he writes, I'm for 24 years I sit now in Karsov Bazaar, לשרת בקודש, להורות להם את הדרך ילכו בה, לשמור ולעשות את כל דברי התורה. ואחרי כי נוכחתי לדעת כי אינם בני תורה. I came here and they know nothing. And they're good people, but they are just, they know nothing. וזמן זמנם זמניהם, לא היה להם מרביץ תורה קרוי, it says for a long time. זמנים זמניהם, for time and times. They didn't have מרביץ תורה כראוי להם. כי הרבנים שקדמוני, even the rabbis that were there before, שפת בני העדה מוזר להם. They couldn't speak this jargon of Tatar language. ולא יכלו לקרב דעתם עמהם ולדעת מעשיהם ותהלוכותיהם בדברים העומדים ברומו של עולם. So they couldn't speak properly even. They couldn't give a drasha. They couldn't explain halacha to these people, שבני אדם הללו מזלזלים בהם לא במרד ולא במעל, ולבית יעקב חטאתם מחסרון ידיעה. The reason they do not keep halacha properly is not because they want to rebel against HaKadosh Baruch Hu Chas v'Chalila, or because they want to sin. They just are uninformed. ידעתי כי למחיה שלחני אלוקים. That's like Yosef, right? That was sent to Egypt to the end of the war, Jewishly, in order to prepare the ground. So he says the same way, I was sent here in order to למחיה, right? To give them life. להרים דגל תורתנו הקדושה, to raise the flag of Torah, the banner of Torah, לשמור גדריה וסייגיה בעזרתו יתברך. And he has different takanot. So, for example, one takana is that it seems that they were not knowledgeable about tvila for women. So they would go during the day and not during the night, which is a great halachic problem. Again, that's not the place now to discuss it. He said what was the solution that he wanted, that he would have the key to the mikvah. Now, I guess he didn't mean that he himself would have the key. I believe he wanted his wife to have the key. However, he says later they didn't work. They didn't want to give him the key. So there was someone responsible. There was a couple that was responsible for the mikvah was adjacent to the bathhouse. There was a public bathhouse. There were no baths in the homes. So the mikvah and the bathhouse was the same facility. So the couple that was running the bathhouse was also running the mikvah, and he had problems with them. It's a long story. As you see, he writes long. So it's a long story, and he writes to other rabbanim, and they give him agreements, and then he writes. Now, I'm not sure to what extent the haskamot that he had from other rabbanim made such an impression on the people there in Crimea. However, he liked, and that's very important, he lived there. So he lived there in the far ends of the world. And the main point is he has no one to speak with. Because it's, again, he's teaching Torah, he's helping them doing mitzvot, but we're thinking about the Talmid Chacham that 99% of the day, his mind is in some Tosfot, in Baba Kama, he's thinking about Zvachim, he's thinking about Kochim. Who can he speak with? So he established a yeshiva and he taught a few guys. By the way, he had 3 daughters that were married to his students there. So one was a shoemaker, and one was a hat maker, and there was another one, which I think he was a carpenter. A tailor. One was a tailor. So a very interesting story. And they were also Talmidei Chacham. But again, what do we mean when you say Talmidei Chacham? There's a big difference when you say Talmidei Chacham in the East League. He was in the NBA, right? Now, the guys that he was teaching there was nice guys, and they knew Torah, and they couldn't be a rabbi of a shul, but that is nothing near what he was. So who can he speak with? He began to write letters. And he had, like the Republic of Letters, if you know this term, from the European different Enlightenment movement. So people that were mailing each other and speaking over the mail. I guess that then you could rely on the mail to come on time. So he was writing in mail to rabbis all over the world. It didn't matter to him. Ashkenazim, Sfaradim, Turkish, whatever. He was happy. Everyone that would write back, he would write to. And many of them entered into his Sefarim, which was a great, if you think about that, that's also a great reason for someone to write him. Because, you know, if I am a small rabbi in a small place in Europe, no one would ever hear about me. But I know that if I would write a letter to Rav Medini sitting in Karsov Bazaar, he would put my letter into his book. And you know what? His books are being read by everyone. So I can just take a ride over his popularity. And so he was right. He was speaking with everyone. He says that he got more than 1,700 letters a year. So I would only guess that the male guys in Karsov Bazaar had a whole small unit in the post office dedicated only for him. So very interesting. He had a few of his Talmidim that their job was to train themselves. Why? Because the Ashkenazim writing in a different style than Sfardim. I'm not speaking about the content and not even the font, just the font. And he had people that their job was to translate, to transcript, I guess, from the Ashkenazic font to the Sephardic font, so it would be easy for him to read. And when he would write back the answer, they would transcript from Sephardic to Ashkenazic. And so he was all over the world, extremely interesting. Many of the letters survived, many did not, but many did survive. As I said, many are found in his book. Now, in 18, I'm beginning to make it a little quicker because our time is almost up. In 1868, as I said, he had 3 daughters and 1 son. The son died, unfortunately, in 1868. He wrote a sefer named Orli, My Light, for Leilui Neshama of his son. And he says, in order to have some light remaining after him. Now he says that my son would not remain after me, at least the sefer would remain after me. And that's the sefer Orli, about practical questions of Orach Chaim. And it's very interesting, the thing that he is Mr. Details. He loved details. You remember we spoke about Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. Reb Chaim Soloveitchik was not interested in details. He was interested in the foundational questions, analytical questions. He is he likes details. You see, he can write a whole 20 pages about, can you get married on a certain mitzvah? Reb Chaim would say, check what the minhag is, and that's it, leave me alone. But for him, these questions are the most interesting questions. And he would write to all ends of the world. Do you get married on Elul? Do you not get married on Elul? Why do you get married? So he finds it very intriguing. So, for example, the questions that he's dealing with in this Orli. If someone wash hands, now you are supposed to make the bracha only after you use the towel, right? You dried your hands with the towel. What happens if you began the bracha before you use the towel? Should you finish the bracha? Should you say... So that's one discussion. Pages upon pages. By the way, finish the bracha. You are not allowed to speak divrei Torah in places that are unclean. Are you allowed to write divrei Torah in such places? Again, pages upon pages. Finally, the bottom line is you are not allowed. What about putting your tzitzit, right, over your clothes outside? Or should you wear it inside your clothes? That's a great machloket between Sfaradim and Ashkenazim. And he is collecting all the material and all the minhagim. If anyone wants to learn about this subject, he is the go-to man because he knows everything about every minhag. So fascinating for people that likes history. And he's writing very clear, very lucid. You can just read it. And you see here, that's from the internet, it is with nekudot. That's amazing. That's amazing. You will not find Reb Chaim Soloveitchik with nekudot. I don't think so. Maybe, but I don't believe. So amazing. He didn't write it with nekudot, but that's a book that people thought it would make sense to add nekudot to. So amazing. It was so poor that in some of the simanim that were, I guess, were longer, so you'd have siman aleph written, siman bet written, siman gimel, I had to take it out because I didn't have enough money to print. And there are about, I counted about 10 simanim that are just missing. And because he didn't have money to print. So it shows, someone else would just say, take off, I guess, the last 20 pages. But I guess it shows the simanim were longer, that he was less sure of, I don't know what was his criteria, but he took them out. So again, I think, amazing. In 1878, he becomes extremely sick. They add the name Chaim, and also he begins to lose his eyesight. Now, he was a phenomenal, I didn't speak about it, but he had a perfect memory. Think about Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. Remember everything you ever read. So he is like a prototype of that. Photographic memory, and he cannot read so well anymore because he is losing his eyesight. So he begins to write everything, and he is writing the Sdei Chemed. What is the Sdei Chemed? Very shortly, it's the first encyclopedia Talmudit. Now, there were encyclopedic works that came before him. The most famous is Pachad Yitzchak of Rabbi Yitzchak Lamfonti. That is from the Renaissance. However, all of these were, comparatively, they were short works. As I said, the Sdei Chemed is 18 volumes in the original work, and he did make it to the end. Now, the Encyclopedia Talmudit they write now, I would say, they work, it's a whole staff. They work on it for 70 years now, and they came to the mem. He finished by himself the whole thing sitting there in his library in Crimea. Now, to be fair, you cannot compare the works. He is giving everything he has. And these are, as I said, 10,000 sforim that he had there because there was no one to speak with. So he had just a huge library, and he was writing, and you get letters, and everything would go into this encyclopedia. However, A, he didn't have everything. And the Encyclopedia Talmudit are doing their best to really, really have everything. And B, he had an excellent memory. He's very lucid, he's very clear, and he's in a great need of a good editor because he writes everything. And he writes something, and he finished that, and 20 pages later he remembers another thing, so he adds it in, and he never goes back to connect it to the. So it's after 18 volumes, it's a huge mess. And it is by the alphabet, but many times it doesn't keep the order. Oh, you'd have the first, so the first entry is Eretz Israel. You all understand that Eretz Israel is not the first entry of any encyclopedia, right? Because it's Aleph Reish. You have many things coming before Aleph Reish. He put Eretz Israel because he loved Eretz Israel. Now, it's a very good reason, but it's very bad for an encyclopedia to go by what you love and not by the order of the alphabet. And that's not the only time he's doing these type of things. There was no index in the first printing. They added an index later after his death. So in the end, it's a wonderful resource if you know where to look. It's extremely difficult to navigate, extremely difficult. And that's the Achilles heel. That's why I would not send you and just say, just go read it, because it is, again, I apologize. I hope that I'm not too harsh. But at least for someone like me, I'm not a great Talmid Chacham. I cannot remember everything I read. I need to be pointed to where I want. And it's not a good work in that manner. It's a wonderful work. If you know where to look, if you had someone else telling you where to look, wow, everything can be found here. But if you're trying to find your way, extremely difficult. It is really looking for someone to take upon himself to re-edit the whole thing. I think that's, now that you can digitalize it, you don't even need to injure the work too much. Because if you don't want to completely, and I understand why no one would want to redo the whole thing the writer wrote, because who gave you permission? But now you can keep the basic order as he did, but hyperline from. Now it's a difficult work. It's a life project. Read the whole thing through and reorganize it digitally. But if it would be done, I think that would be a great service to the Jewish nation. Anyhow, at the age of 67, after 32 years in Kaso Bazar, he decides to go back to Eretz Israel because he wants to finish the Sdei Chemed quietly, and he doesn't want to be a rabbi anymore. And he's 67, so it's a pension age. So he's returning to Eretz Israel. he first go to Yerushalayim, but they want him to be the Rav there, so he go to Hebron so he can sit quietly, and he sits there for 2 years. No. Yeah, 2 years in Hebron, and then the chief rabbi of Hebron, Rav Franco, passed away, and they just force him to become the Rav of Hebron. It doesn't do him. He's fighting against the Haskalam. Again, that's something that we would have to speak about much more in length, but we don't have the time. And when we speak about Haskalah in Eretz Israel with other rabbis, I think that we would have more to say. He lives in Bet Romano. If anyone here was in Hebron, Yeshivat Shavei Hebron is in Bet Romano or near Bet Romano, and they have a whole, they redone the whole thing. You can visit there. They have some of his library. When he passed away in 1905, he contributed his huge library to the Beit Cholim Misgav Ladach, which was back then in the old city in Yerushalayim. They took it. Now, he intended for them to sell and to take the money. They didn't want to sell because it was a huge and wonderful library. So they kept it there for learning. However, 43 years later, in 1948, as we all know, the Jordanians conquered the old city, and they bombed the hospital with many of the books that were there. Some they were able to smuggle out and to save, and these books, after many more, as you can imagine, many more Gilgulim, they ended up in this Bet Romano, in the reconstructed home of Rav Hezekiah Medini. So you can visit it. Maybe we would all make a siyur of this shiur to Hebron. And an interesting story, after he died, we finished with that, in 1905, they buried him in Hebron, in the cemetery there. And a day later, someone came to the grave, and he saw 2 Arab guys trying to dig him out. Now, it's not clear if they wanted to dig him out because they wanted to have money from the Jews there for the body, or because they believed that he was a holy man, so they thought that his body would somehow help them, some segula or something. So there are different versions there. And the Jews of Hebron had to put guard for a long time over the graveyard in order to prevent the Arabs from digging out his body. So again, an amazing tzaddik, an amazing personality, very important work, Sdei Chemed, that still is waiting, I think at least, for its elevation, and a huge lover of Eretz Israel and Yerushalayim, as we saw both from the poem that he wrote and the fact that he did return to Eretz Israel in the end of his life. Thank you very much. Obviously, next week is Purim, so no shiur. Next week, and we would re-meet 2 weeks. יש אישור, שדה חרב.
לעצמו. איפה זה ניצח שדה חרב?
שדה חמד.